Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being with us this evening. I'm Vicki Wilkins. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs at American University, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's Madison Prize for Constitutional Excellence. We're honored to recognize our winners this year, Senator Amy Klobuchar and former Senator Rob Portman. None of this would, yep. None of this would be possible without the efforts of David and Laura Skaggs, who established the Madison Prize in 2017. David served as a member of the United States House of Representatives from 1987 to 1999. He represented the 2nd District of Colorado. One of David's most notable achievements during his time in Congress was his environmental record, sponsoring the Colorado Wilderness Act of 1993 and co-sponsoring the Energy Act of 1992. He was also proud to be a co-sponsor of the Americans with Disability Act in 1990. His dedication to democracy and public service is rooted in his experience as a Marine officer who served in Vietnam with the 1st Marine Division. He is married to Laura Skaggs, and they have 3 children and 6 grandchildren. David is a staunch believer in the value of compromise and democracy, which he sees as essential for any legislator. He remains optimistic about the idea for the future of American democracy, despite the challenges we face. Unfortunately, David and Laura cannot be with us tonight. However, David sent remarks for me to read on his behalf, and I'm happy to do so. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending this event to award the Madison Prizes for the 117th Congress. I can't tell you how much I'd rather be with you than where I am. David is at home nursing a newly implanted titanium hip joint. He cracked the ball off his femur when he fell planting strawberry plants in his garden last Thursday afternoon. He says, "Let me thank the good folks of American University who have put tonight's event together. Professor David Barker, Dean Vicki Wilkins, Lisa Manning, and Victoria Black. I know there are others. Please forgive me for not calling them out. Let me also thank my old and dear friend, Professor Emeritus Jim Thurber, who initially welcomed the idea of the Madison Prizes and shepherded the proposal to conclusion. It is an honor to be able to recognize 2 outstanding U.S. Senators, Amy Klobuchar and just retired colleague Rob Portman. I've never met Senator Klobuchar, but I was privileged to serve with Rob in the House before he went over to the other body. Many thanks to President Sylvia Burwell, who will shortly treat you all to a discussion with the senators. So why the Madison Prize, and what's this supposed to be about? My wife, Laura, who joined me in establishing this endowment and who sends her regrets, often accuses me of being more at home in the 18th century than the 21st. Like me, I suspect most of you attending here have marveled at the genius and the courage of our founders. For me, their virtues and successes will always outshine their failures, none more so than James Madison. Madison's contribution to the philosophical underpinnings of Americans' representative democracy were coupled to its practical understanding of what it takes for that representative democracy to work. For me, the quintessential statement that marries political theory and practice is Madison's Federalist 10. It has special appeal to those of us in the business by invoking the higher purposes of politics. He explains in elegant terms that our system of government depends fundamentally on the willingness and the ability of legislators to compromise, to work out differences, to make deals. Despite the degradation of the term during campaign season, compromise remains the central business of legislative bodies, federal, state, and local. The Madison Prizes are given to honor members of the Senate or House from each party who exemplify the practice of compromise, and to remind us that working out compromises to resolve differences in our diverse and fractious society is very important, especially these days. Thanks to Senators Portman and Klobuchar for having the courage to see compromise as one way to achieve success. I know you will join me in sending our very best to David in his recovery and our thanks to Laura. At the School of Public Affairs and American University, it is in our DNA to promote legislative compromise, bipartisanship, and civil discourse. These are all at the core of our democracy and necessary elements for our students and partners to embrace. It's now my pleasure to introduce the 15th president of American University and the first woman to serve as president, Sylvia Burwell. Yes, you can clap it. President Burwell is an experienced leader who has spent the past 6 years helping AU excel as a leading student-centered research university, more than doubling our research funding from external organizations, delivering unique experiential learning opportunities in Washington, D.C. and beyond, and building a growing community of change makers. Under her leadership, AU has become the first urban university in the United States to achieve carbon neutrality and launch the first anti-racist research and policy center, as well as a new state-of-the-art Hall of Science building, and the Sign Institute for Policy and Politics, which is an incubator for policy innovation. She's led the university through a historic pandemic, started the $500 million Change Can't Wait campaign to fund new efforts in student thriving, which is now $100 million. Actually, it's more like $97 million from our goal, as well as a comprehensive strategy, Change Makers for a Changing World. Prior to AU, President Burwell had held two cabinet positions in the United States government, serving as Secretary of Health and Human Services and Director of the Office of Management and Budget. As HHS Secretary, she managed a $1 trillion department with 12 operating divisions, including NIH, FDA, and the Medicaid and Medicare programs. At OMB, she worked with Congress to negotiate the 2-year budget deal following the 2013 government shutdown. In both roles, she is known as a leader who worked successfully across aisles and focused on delivering results for American people. She also held leadership positions at 2 of the largest foundations in the world, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Walmart Foundation. President Burwell and her husband, Stephen, are the proud parents of 2 teenagers. Please join me in welcoming Sylvia Burwell.
Thank you. Vicki, thank you so much. And I actually do want to begin just by all of us thanking David and Laura, even though they aren't here, for their support and for the idea and concept. And also thank you all to the senators for both coming today to do this. And we're joined today by our 2023 Madison Prize for Constitutional Excellence winners. And I've actually had the privilege of working with both of them, which is a wonderful thing. I served, as you heard, as the Director of Office Management Budget and Health and Human Services Secretary. And before I introduce the senators, I just do want to take a moment to actually thank you. Because having had the opportunity, and I see folks and even many of our students who spend time on the Hill, these are tough jobs and it takes an incredible commitment. And I just really want to begin with saying thank you. Every day is hard. Thank you for the work, and thank you for your incredible commitment to our country. Appreciate it. Senator Rob Portman's career in public service spanned 3 decades, as was mentioned in terms of the House, and he served in 2 presidential administrations as director of OMB, something we share, and U.S. Trade Representative. He was elected to 2 terms in the U.S. Senate, representing my neighboring state of West Virginia in Ohio, and 6 terms in the House. He retired from the Senate in January and now serves as a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He also founded the Portman Center for Policy Solutions at the University of Cincinnati, my mother's alma mater. I knew Senator Portman before, but got to know him. I knew you before, but really got to know you when I became director of OMB. Actually, the former directors, it is like a club, and we do help and support each other. And so I benefited many times from collaboration and advice on many issues in my time. So thank you for that. Senator Amy Klobuchar is the first woman to be elected to represent the state of Minnesota in the U.S. Senate. And before serving in the Senate, she led the largest prosecutor's office in Minnesota for 8 years. She currently serves as the chairwoman of the Rules Committee and the Democratic Steering and Outreach Committee, and is a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, the Agricultural, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee, and the Joint Economic Committee. And in the last Congress, she led the most bills with a bipartisan co-sponsor, and also had the opportunity to work with Senator Klobuchar on any number of things during my time in the Obama administration, including a quite memorable visit to the state and the very special when you're Secretary of Health and Human Services, Mayo Clinic. So I know both Rob and Amy to be doers, people who actually roll up their sleeves and get the real work done. And they do that with a willingness to reach out to others and to listen to the point of view of others, even when they disagree. And over the years, they actually have collaborated with each other on a number of important issues, from the war in Ukraine to affordable housing to clamping down on fentanyl. And they both firmly believe in reaching out across the aisle to listen, to engage, and to come together to build solutions for the American people. We're honored to be joined by you all today. And would you please step up so we can present you with your awards? These are heavy. Now we're going to have a little bit of a conversation. So why don't we all have a seat up here? Okay, where do you want us to sit? Right here? Me? Where else you can sit here? Y'all sit. Okay, good. All right. So because the theme of the award is this idea of working together and bipartisan compromise and working across the aisle, I'd love for each of you to give an example of when it worked, when you worked across the aisle and when it worked, and actually give an example. We've got a lot of our students in our community here of when it actually didn't work and the lessons that you learned when that happened. So let's start with an example that actually worked. You want to start for us?
Okay, sure. I see a bunch of my staff are here, so they'll be mad if I don't say that we had a lot of bipartisan successes. There they are.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Bills signed in the past 12 years by presidents of 3 different parties. How am I doing? So, so working with Amy, we've passed a lot of legislation together. But the one I want to talk about just briefly is infrastructure, since everybody knew about that at the time and probably even now are benefiting from it, I hope. But this is something that Congress had talked about really for 40 years. And when you have to go back, actually, you could go back to the interstate highway system in the 1960s to see the last major bill. But presidents of both parties had infrastructure weeks where this is it, we're going to do it. And you may remember President Trump called a bunch of Democrats down to the White House one day and said, we're going to do infrastructure together. Amy, I don't know if you were part of that group, but I remember Tom Carper coming back and being so excited because they'd said to President Trump, we're going to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure. And he said in his way, I'm a builder, we're going to do $2 trillion. And of course, they did zero. But it was just like this, year after year after year, right, Amy? I mean, we would talk about it, Republicans and Democrats alike, and we could never figure it out. And the reason is, it's hard, as we found out. So we did this little group, and it started off with just 2 of us, and then 5 of us, and then 10 of us, and then 20 of us, and Amy and others were involved in helping to put it together, and it was sort of from the inside out. So for students who are here who think Congress is all about throwing out the red meat and controversy, this is an example of where we were able to get something done without any leadership really involvement, to be frank with you. The White House was helpful. Initially, President Biden's proposal for infrastructure was dead on arrival because it had huge taxes in it and had a lot of non-infrastructure spending, if you think of core infrastructure, roads and bridges. So we had a very simple concept, which is let's take out the actual core infrastructure, which was roughly half of it, and let's take out the taxes and find other ways to pay for it, and let's pass this thing. And we did, and it passed at the end with 69 votes, including a majority, of course, of Democrats and almost a majority of Republicans. So it was a very bipartisan bill, and it was an example where you can help people in a bipartisan way. I will say at least a dozen times it was given up as dead. The media declared it dead. It's not going anywhere because we had little skirmishes between ourselves sometimes, and certainly with the White House. But we just kept focusing on that objective, which is how do you get this thing done and how do you reach that common ground? And that's really what government ought to be about.
Okay.
Amy, an example.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. By the way, and every time, as Rob would attest to, that Sylvia came into a room, we knew we could get something done in her job, and she had respect on both sides of the aisle. So it's a pleasure to be here with you and the dean, and we wish David well. I was thinking of my friend Rob, many stories to tell, but an example of his bipartisan persuasiveness outside of the U.S. Senate was when my daughter started college, and his son, Will, was at the same school, but he was a few years older than my daughter. So Rob was going to speak to a residential college and said, well, maybe I should invite your daughter. And I said, well, she's a brand new freshman, but okay. So she gets invited. He personally sends her a note, invites her. She decides to go. She goes, he's really nice to her, introduces her. There's all these seniors and juniors there. She calls me after it's done. Oh, Mom, I really like Senator Portman a lot. It's during the Affordable Care Act debate, which Sylvia will appreciate. She goes, Mom, Senator Portman was talking about how maybe President Obama should do some things differently, and how maybe there should be some negotiations about this and this and this. Very reminiscent of now, by the way. Why aren't those? And I go, when I explain the whole thing, and then she pushes something else, and I go, honey, you have just been with Rob Portman for 1 hour, and you have lived with me your entire life. And the answer was, yeah, Mom, but Senator Portman has such a nice manner. That is a true story. Okay, on to the present. So things that I thought we could.
She's now a Republican, by the way.
Yeah, not so lucky for you. No. Okay, so things that. Big things we got done, and then I'll do a little one, maybe not that little, but maybe not what you'd think of first. The Electoral Count Act at the end of this year, Rob was involved in that, and that was a big, as the president would say, big effing deal. And by the way, I thought about the president when I walked in here, because if anyone heard the speech at the Washington Correspondents' Dinner, at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, he was very serious. He did this whole thing about the First Amendment. I thought, is he going to use humor at all? Okay. And all of a sudden he goes, yeah, Constitution really important to me because, Jimmy Madison and I were friends way back. True story. All right. So the big thing to me when we got that Electoral Count Act, as Rob knows, Roy Blunt and I are very close, and we chaired the Rules Committee, and then Joe Manchin and Susan were working on the bill, but we were kind of helping to shepherd and guide it through. And so we not only had to work with the House that kind of had a more aggressive manner with things that I would have liked to do and were in an original bill. We had to work with actually Liz Cheney and Zoe Lofgren, but we also had to try to get as strong a support we could because, as you know, this was viewed as possibly could go partisan on us really fast. And I was really proud of the committee, actually, the Rules Committee, with the exception of one person, okay, Ted Cruz. All the Republicans voted for the bill, which dramatically, I'm not going to go in the details, but made changes so one member of Congress can't just hold up the will of the people on the day that we're supposed to count the ballots, because that memory of Roy and me and Vice President Pence walking at 4 a.m. is forever etched and defined my work in the last few years walking over the broken glass and the pillar of spray painted vulgarities, which in the morning had been this celebration, was something that just meant to me, we can't let this ever happen again. So that was a big bipartisan moment. Maybe a smaller thing, but something that was just so much fun to work on was when Senator Cornyn and I teamed up to pass the Save Our Stages bill that I led. And that was because the venues, which is all the music venues, theaters, arts, museums, were the first to close in the pandemic, and we knew they were going to last to open, because you can't stand in a mosh pit in the middle of a pandemic, something I said on the Senate floor quite a few times. But thank God for country western bands in Texas, because Senator Cornyn was great to work on, and we ended up making, on the bill, we ended up making the biggest investment in the arts in the history of America with that bill, and we kept 12,000 venues open. And I got a star on First Avenue, right next to Alice Cooper. First Avenue is the iconic place in Minneapolis where Prince got his start. So that made my whole career worth it, basically. So there you go.
That is a big one. That is a big one. So those are some of the victories, and when it happens and it works, and we all get to benefit from those incredible contributions, whether it's how our infrastructure will be done, make us a more competitive nation, the economic benefits, or those venues and the idea that our electoral system will be protected. Can you give an example of where you tried and it didn't work, and therefore what was the learning? Because that's what I'm hoping we can share with others in terms of, as the people, many of the people in this room are the people trying to make it, your staff, trying to make it happen every day.
Well, lots of examples of that. And I will say, one thing that might be worth talking about, and President Burwell, to the students here, remembers this very well, because she was very involved in healthcare, both at OMB and then, of course, as a Secretary of HHS. And it's up and down, right? So there are successes and there are failures even within a single effort. And that's not unusual. And sometimes there's failure, and then finally a victory. I would say Electoral Count Act is an example of that. Finally, we were able to get it done. But the one I will mention is very timely, because it happened in 2011 when we were facing a debt limit crisis. Sound familiar? So I understand that Secretary Yellen has just informed us that the debt limit may come up sooner than expected, maybe even within a month.
June 1st was the date.
So here we are. But in this case, you may recall there was a failure to find agreement, and so the Vice President of the United States, a guy named Joe Biden, and the Republican leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, got together and came up with a proposal that was later accepted by all four leaders, saying that there would be a committee established which would have the extraordinary ability to take something back to the House and the Senate for an up or down vote, which would focus on the entire spectrum, taxes, spending, and so on, but specifically would deal with mandatory spending, so-called entitlements, which of course is that third rail of the New York subway system. If you grab it, you get electrified. And so the super committee was formed, and I was honored to be asked to be part of it, and really excited about it. As Jane will tell you, I spent a lot of weekends here working on it. I was naive enough to think that it could work, and I thought it was actually brilliant that we would extend the debt limit, which was, of course, something we had to do, but in the context, we would put in place a bipartisan proposal that did much of what people, I think, generally understand has to be done, which is to deal with the biggest part of our spending, the 70% that is on autopilot, so-called mandatory spending. And we worked and worked and worked at it, and at the end of the day, sadly, we were not able to come up with a solution. And we can talk about the reasons why, but it's sort of the fundamental difference: Republicans not wanting to do enough on revenue, Democrats not wanting to do enough on the spending side, and we just couldn't find that elusive common ground. So it was a big disappointment to me, and more importantly to the country, because we find ourselves even deeper now in debt, and with even a bigger problem. It's a deeper and deeper hole to dig out of, and it will require more sacrifice as a result. So I wish we'd been successful, but we were not. However, almost all of our suggested changes on the domestic discretionary spending side, so the 30% of spending that Congress appropriates every year, were eventually picked up, and some of our mandatory changes were also picked up. So much of the supercommittee's work actually did get implemented over time and resulted in some savings to the budget and ultimately the ability to reduce the deficit, at least on the domestic discretionary side in particular, a little bit to move us forward. But here we are again, and my hope is that this time there will be a way forward. I actually, and Amy and I haven't talked about this, but I nominate her. I think we need some leaders to step up and say, let's do it again, but this time maybe include some outside experts and maybe have a little more time to do it, and maybe have it report right after the election, since this tends to be a rather political issue, particularly the mandatory spending side, and come up with another sort of Simpson-Bowles type approach or super committee type approach, but that has statutory grounding, so that people like Amy could be involved who actually want to get something done, and again, bring it back to Congress from up or down the bill. Congress ultimately will have the say. But we have to solve this problem, and this might be the right context to do it.
By far, my number one feeling of just, on Christmas Eve when you're holding up the candles and you think, what haven't you gotten done, is immigration reform. I think about it for many reasons of people that are in limbo in this country, specifically the Afghan refugees right now, which is a bill I'm trying to get done with Lindsey Graham, yet we still weren't able to get it on any larger bill at the end of the year. 80,000 people who are in our country right now, half of them literally have letters from the US military vouching for them, yet they are in limbo. It's a travesty. But the larger issue of immigration reform, we tried once under President Bush, and he really wanted to get it done, which Rob knows. He tried very hard. I think as I look at the lessons from all of the 3 stories I'm about to tell, none of which have a happy ending. George Bush wanted to get it done. He put his all in, but it was at the end of his term, and he had lost some clout after he tried to take on remember, Social Security. And so, because it got tied in with the privatization issue, and then it was harder for him to take on immigration. And he was sort of a lame duck at the moment the last 2 years, but he really did try hard to get it done. It got tubed in part because of talk radio in the beginnings. That was kind of the beginnings of the pushback on the far right, and that was what pretty much killed it. Then the second time was under Obama. Again, he waited until later in his second term, but this time we were able to get it through the U.S. Senate. And Grassley was chair, I think, of the Judiciary Committee, and we still got it done. And by the way, my mind on this is what's happening. My state has the lowest unemployment rate in the country. In the rural areas, we don't have enough workers, and in tourism, and so many of these things. And then you look at what we need in the medical profession, what we need in our nursing homes, and no great nation has grown and expanded with a shrinking workforce. We could try to be an experiment and see if it happens. I think we're going to find a rude awakening that it's going to go the other way. So for me, it's not just some issue of the morality of what's going on. It is actually an economic imperative we get this done. So that failed because it got in the free John Boehner's freezer or something. I don't know. It just lost in the House, even though we passed it on a bipartisan basis in the Senate. Then the third time was not comprehensive, but it was during Trump when Mike Rounds and a group of 15 of us, which included John McCain and included, I remember Tim Kaine and I were both in it, a number of other people, Heidi Heitkamp, and we had enough Republican votes for that. We did. We had 10 to 15, and we were going to be able to beat the filibuster and get it done, and then Trump basically gut punched us on it, his administration. That would have been Dreamers, with green cards, path to citizenship. It would have been the temporary status people. There's millions here. It would have been more visas and lifting up the work permits, which is exactly what we need right now. And then it would have been more money at the border and order at the border. That was that deal, and that was ready to go through because the House would have passed it. Those were the 3 times. So I'm ready to try a 4th, but at the very least, we need to do something in the immediate about work permits and visas, because there are certain areas of the country right now where there's not going to be a place to bring grandma and grandpa because we don't have enough workers. And with more and more people wanting to go remote and the like and looking for that flexibility, it gets even harder to get people who want to go and work in hospitals or work in nursing homes or be a police officer. And we need people to do those jobs. So it's a combination of apprenticeships and incentives for college and the like, and what we do to get people in those jobs with our workers that are right here, but it's also immigration reform. And we've got, an extraordinary number of people who were Nobel laureates from the US who are immigrants or kids of immigrants. We've got something like 40% of our Fortune 500 CEOs, immigrants, kids of immigrants. It just goes on and on for what we have. America is immigrants. They don't diminish America. They are America.
Thank you, and I am a second-generation immigrant, so I am one of those in terms of most people look and don't think, but yes, all four of my grandparents immigrated to this country. There was a theme in something that both of you said that I'd like to ask you about, and that is, there is this question, and it was when you're in the executive branch and trying to work on these deals, there's always the question of when do you move from the big to the small? You described that a number of the pieces and parts from the big got done. And you described moving on the immigration. And the question, I would ask you all is like, how do you think about that judgment about when to move from the big to the small? And how do you think about the question of when you move from the big to the small, or when you do compromise, you've moved and you've given something up and you've given the ability to do the big, and we've all heard this, like, I'm sure you can imagine how many times I heard it when I was negotiating Medicaid agreements, in terms of when you have to compromise. How do you think about this big to the small? And it's the same question as, how do you think about like when to compromise on the issues?
I think you just have to decide, is what you're doing worth it? Have you just negotiated it down to some ridiculous thing that sometimes can even make things worse, and just pretend you're doing something or do some minor little study that doesn't do anything? Then you're better off just saying, that's it, let's just wait and go back another time. But there are numerous examples of where you start at a certain amount of money and you've negotiated down. The infrastructure bill is a huge deal with broadband all over the country. People didn't get everything they wanted in that bill, and Rob showed tremendous leadership on that. Here's one hard example, the gun bill. And obviously, I would have done a lot more in that. Joe Manchin announced that he was for banning assault weapons purchases for 18 to 21 in that bill, because those perpetrators in Uvalde, deranged young men in Uvalde and in Buffalo, were both waited till they turned 18 and bought them on the internet, bought assault weapons. To me, there's no explaining it. However, we weren't able to get that. We weren't able to get the assault weapon ban in that, and we were not able to get universal background checks, something 80% of people are for. So the question is in light of what we saw in Louisville and what we saw in Nashville, is it worth it? And I'd argue it was worth doing what we did. You know why? One, we finally took on the NRA, and there were Republicans that were willing to say, okay, I'm going to do this, it's worth it, and they voted for it, and I think that means something and paves the way for something in the future. Number two, we got significant funding for mental health, things that are going to take a while to work their way through but are good. Close the boyfriend loophole on domestic cases. There are a number of things that happened, but the bigger thing that happened to me was we finally made some movement. That sets the pace in my mind for that moment, that magic moment where we can do something that actually matters. And I'll just end with this story of, I was in Nashville a few weeks ago, about a week after the shooting. I went to a bookstore, Ann Padgett, who I like because I like her writing, and I just went there for fun. Every so often we do stuff for fun. And I had gone to the school that morning, and I met with a bunch of elected officials, and then I was just in there, and this mom walked by, and she was just sobbing, and she had the books in this bag, and she knew who Ann was, and she knew who I was. And she had a daughter in the 3rd grade class who was best friends of the 2 girls that got killed. She had a picture from a week before. And then she pulled out her phone, and it was the text message of the moms. And the morning of the shooting, including the 2 of the moms of the kids that were killed, they were talking about a jazz festival in the school. Normal text. What do we got this artist because it's Nashville? What if we did this? What if we did this with it? And all of a sudden, one of the moms of Eva, who was killed, says, there's a live shooting, it can't be right. Someone says it's just a lie on the internet. No, it's right. You just leave the text. It's right. I hear the sirens. I hear the sirens. And the next text is, we're going to be at the fire hall. We're going there now. And the next text is, hallelujah, they found Haley. They found Haley. They found this. They found that. And the very last text is that mom that started it, Eva's mom, saying, we've lost Eva. And so you saw it as in real time as it happened. And it just makes you see, we have to do more. But then I don't at all look back at what we did and think, oh, what a disaster. I think it was a start. So those are the kind of decisions. In that case, it was Chris Murphy and John Cornyn and a few of the rest of us that worked on it. You just have to make those hard decisions and then decide, we will fight this another day, but we've made a difference.
Rob, for you.
Well, first of all, as a Republican who was a co-sponsor of that bill and part of it,
Thank you.
I agree with Amy. I think it was absolutely worth doing. And you and I were at OMB. We had a lot of grandiose ideas and a lot of grandiose members of the cabinet who had even more grandiose ideas. And often you sort of wonder, why can't the Congress just do this? You know, we'll just change America. It's not how it works. You know, you have to rely on incremental reform, and sometimes that's frustrating when you're on the executive side. It was for me, it was for you. But I've got to tell you, I mean, and the gun safety bill is an example of this. I mean, we had sort of lost our muscle memory as to how to do any of this. And my greatest worry after 30 years of public service and working for a few different administrations and in these House and Senate jobs and doing a lot of bipartisan work is I think that muscle memory is needed now more than ever. And it's true, in my view, that every force is working the other way. So it's almost like centrifugal force, you know, pushing people out more to the extremes. And it's politics. Let's face it, it's easier to raise money on the internet now than it is to go to major donors, and that's what people do for the most part. Most money, Amy, I guess today is being raised in $30, $40, $50 increments. And the way you raise that money is you go hard to the right or hard to the left. I can say that because when I was thinking of running again, my consultants came to me and said, you got to change your whole, you know, internet fundraising approach because, you know, you won't say these things you have to say if you really want to get people excited. And I said, well, I'm not running again. No reason. But I mean, it's just hard to do it if you really are trying to get things done because you have to take on the other side. And when you're saying, you know, I don't know, Nancy Pelosi is the devil incarnate, and then you got to go work with her, it's a little hard, you know, or Mitch McConnell is, and when he shows up on the floor, he's seen that email that you sent out. And then the media side of this. I mean, you think of the cable shows that some of you probably watch on occasion. Fortunately, most Americans don't, but you know, they thrive on controversy, whether it's MSNBC or whether it's Fox. If you want to go on and talk about the issues, as Amy and I have done, they usually aren't much interested. I will say there's some exceptions, and I think we were on Brett Baer together once on fentanyl, and he wants to hear from both sides. And Ukraine, that's right, we went on, but those are rare, you know. And so the media pushes you. The centrifugal force is if you want to get standing and get exposure, you got to be willing to be controversial. And then I would say media in general is true with regard to the online influence on politics, which is people tend to look online to reinforce their views and sometimes go down these rabbit holes that can get even dangerous, but certainly push people to the outside also. Then the final one is just how our primary system has become the priority rather than the general election. And people don't vote in primaries like they should. That's one of the problems. And those who do vote in primaries make the decision often. Districts are more red or blue, states are more red and blue. So I worry about this notion that if we don't figure out what Dean Wilkins talked about earlier, which you talked about, President Burwell, which is how do you train a new generation of students, some of whom are in this room, to think about politics differently, that it's not a zero-sum game, that you have to figure out ways to find that elusive common ground ultimately. And the simple way I look at it is in your own family, in your business, in whatever profession you're in, you got to compromise, unless you're one of these fortunate maybe high-tech CEOs who can tell everybody what to do. You really have to learn how to do this also in politics again. Almost like we have to relearn it. So to your question, do you do incremental change or do you do the big picture? We just have to get back to making a difference. And to Amy's point that the gun safety bill made a difference, by the way, a lot of it has not been implemented yet. No. And when it is, on the mental health side in particular, it'll make a bigger difference. And also when more states take advantage of the incentives we provided to have these so-called red flag laws with due process. That will make a bigger difference. And in all these cases, maybe with the exception of one recently, I think those would have been very helpful, both of those things. So some of these, even the infrastructure bill takes a little time to be implemented. That's frustrating, but they are making a difference, and we've got to keep at it.
Thank you, and I want to circle back to a topic you raised, and that turns out I planned to talk about it, and turns out today it's quite relevant, and that is the debt ceiling. So, as you mentioned in terms of the history, I actually was at the US Treasury Department when Secretary Rubin, I was his chief of staff, when we actually implemented the extraordinary measures that aren't extraordinary anymore because we've actually passed the debt limit, and we're using measures to make sure that we are not defaulting at this point. And I wanted to talk about, how do you see a path to getting there in terms of the nation not going into default, which would be, if we think SVB and what happened with the bank in terms of liquidity in the system, that is nothing compared to, I don't think people really focus on and recognize what happens when the federal government stops making payments. But more than that, it will lock up the entire system, most likely, in terms of there won't be liquidity. It'd be nice, you may have access to something, but you won't have access. So this is a really important one. And how do you think about how to get a deal so that we don't have what would be a crisis, of great magnitude for the nation? And then the second part of this question is, should we get rid of the debt limit in terms of what it is? And Rob, why don't we start with you as a OMB director? You know what it does and doesn't
This one,
do.
Amy.
We'll start here.
Well, just
Outside perspective would be so helpful.
How do we get a deal? How do we get a deal? And should we just get rid of the thing as part of the deal?
Yeah, I've been part of a number of these, including going back to the first Bush administration, when, remember 1990, there was the Andrews Air Force deal, and I was there during that. I was Director of Legislative Affairs in the first Bush White House, and we were right up to the edge. We thought that a $250 billion deficit was just a horrible thing, and that's why President Bush was willing to raise taxes, which some would say led to his defeat in his reelection efforts, because remember Pat Buchanan took it up, and then George Mitchell took it up, and so there's political danger in all this. But here's what I think: we have to get to a point where we're talking to each other. So of course we can't go over the debt limit. On the other hand, we owe it to the American people to have a conversation, and it's crazy to me that we can't sit down and talk. And I know some Democrats strongly disagree with that and say there could be no negotiation, which is what President Obama took as his position the third or fourth time he went through this, not in the first few times when we actually made some progress. I'm not going to put Amy on the spot here because she'll put herself on the spot, as she usually does. But I've heard her in the last week say, you know what, we should talk. And I agree totally. Now, what we actually come up with may not be nearly enough for some House Republicans who have sent a strong message by passing legislation. Good for them. They passed legislation that laid out what the conditions would be for extending the debt limit. It won't be all of that, but it could be some of that. And I go back to what I said earlier, which is if people would embrace this idea that we know we have to do something here, and by the way, the vast majority of the American people agree with that, then that could be part of it, which is a process. I know that may sound to some like you're kicking the can down the road, but you know what? If it's statutory and it can come back for an up or down vote, it would really have teeth. And again, give it a little time, maybe reporting in November of 2024, a magic date, or year-end 2024. But that would be, I think, I mentioned earlier, incremental reform, the ability for us to actually find common ground. I think that would be a very positive result of this, rather than just saying, we're not going to negotiate, which is, I don't think that's a reasonable position, or, we're going to, cut domestic discretionary spending by 30-40%, which is not going to happen. So there must be some good middle ground there, and one certainly is this process idea to just sit down, Republicans and Democrats, and figure out what do we do going forward.
So I believe they are going to meet in the next, given this new date that we just literally found out about, June 1st. I think a lot of people thought it was originally between June and August. I think that expedites things, so there will be discussions. Now, I was actually arguing and still argue the time for that negotiation is on the budget, because we're operating under a budget that 18 Senate Republicans voted for, and that if I could wave a magic wand, I do think we should do general reform of how this whole process works. It's crazy. Though I'm for 2-year budgeting, that's a Jeanne Shaheen bill. Instead of 1 year, I think that overall would help our country to be on a more even keel. It doesn't mean you can't still respond to emergencies and do things and have funds set aside, but I think this way we do this all the time, it doesn't help us in our competitiveness around the world. We just got out of a pandemic, and we were all in millions of different silos, and our economy is finally coming back, and we still have supply chain issues. So I think defaulting on America, defaulting on our debt, be the very worst thing we could do right now. And that budget, to me, which the discussions belong on the budget, not on the debt. What they passed is I think you've seen what it does. It's just based on discretionary. It's a 22% cut, and yet discussions like this should be on the budget. So I hope when they meet the leaders with the president, that one, they discuss the consequences of this, the stock market, what in 2011, even the threat of it brought our credit ratings down. And then they go on to discuss a process, honestly, of how this could be worked into a discussion on the budget. So that's maybe too much of a dream, but to me, that's a rational way to do it. There are other things, by the way, that are worth talking about that they could discuss at the time. Permitting reform is something that both Democrats, I voted for Manchin's bill. I don't know, about a little more than half our caucus voted for it. It was a mess on the Republican side for other reasons, but yeah, you voted. Of course he did. But that would help with energy projects of all kinds that we really need right now. And that is something hanging out there that is fiscally related, but on its face isn't. And there are many other things that we could be talking about right now that need to be done immediately that could be rolled into the same time period of discussion. So otherwise, we're just going to sit here. Other thing I would change is there's too many people that have to be confirmed by the Senate. And I would just love to change. They've added more people as time goes on. I would love to change that for our new president when you don't even know who the president is. Something that Senator Langford's been interested in for a while. The assistant to the assistant to the assistant to the deputy, that maybe we should let a president, whoever it is, more quickly get in their people. I'm not talking about changing debate on cabinet members or anything like that. And then the other thing we could do, which is more small ball, but we could block them and vote on them all at once. Not all of them, but say you have 10 defense nominees. If we voted on them all at once after 4 hours of debate or whatever it is, cabinet on their own, you could move those faster. So I just think there are many things we should be doing in this world economy that we're in to make us more productive, more efficient, more leader. And the way you do that is just these reforms to the way we're doing things economically, but also how we're working in the Senate. So I have a book coming out that says a lot of this, not to come on, next Monday. And it's
1-800-AMY.
Yeah, it's called The Joy of Politics. Really good timing. And it was announced the same day as Bernie's book. My book is The Joy of Politics, and his book is called It's Okay to Be Angry at Capitalism. But one of the segments I have in this book is Ideas for Reform, which I really think we need to do.
So we can talk about debt limits just for a second. So one thing that gets lost sometimes in this discussion is that we do have a crisis in terms of our fiscal condition. And we kind of forget about it because interest rates were low for so long, the economy was so good, even though debt was building up and building up and building up. But now we are looking at a debt as a percent of our economy, which is probably how you ought to look at it, which is, I would argue, by far worse than it's ever been. There was 1 year after World War II where it was this high, but we didn't have Medicare then, as an example. We also had just spent a lot on a war that we could immediately reduce, which we did. So it's an entirely different context. And this is really frightening for not just future generations, for this generation. Why? Because, as Sylvia said, you could have real economic repercussions if we don't deal with it. So we have to get back to the $32 trillion and say, this is this is a huge problem for our country and its current economy, not just the future. Second, just realizing that as awkward as the debt limit is, and as much as some people would like it for it to just go away as an issue, it does force Congress to act. And if you look since the mid-1980s with Gramm-Rudman, which was done during a debt limit crisis, there have been about 8 reductions in spending. Now, have they been adequate? No. Super committee was not adequate, but it did something, as I said earlier. And all 8 of those came out of what process? A debt limit discussion. So the only time we've really been able to get at the spending issue has been in the context of debt limit. So is it scary? Yeah, and it's very scary for me right now because not only has the time frame been sped up, but there seems to be no negotiation on an alternative. And we have to have an alternative. We can't go over the limit. We will have downgrades this time, and it will affect all of us and all the people who we all represent or represented. So, but I just wanted to throw that out there because sometimes that gets lost in the whole discussion, is that we really do have a crisis, one, and second is that at least historically, for the last 30 years, all that's really worked to get Congress to pay attention to this has been this debt limit discussion.
Which calls into question what forces the Congress to act. And actually, my senior thesis in college was on deregulation of the thrift industry, for those of you who want a good nighttime read. But that was the hypothesis. Banking regulation will only occur in the U.S. You will only have reform. That was the hypothesis of my senior thesis in college, which was about the thrift industry.
You only have reform if you have a crisis, like the Dodd-Frank thing.
Well, you end up, and that's why you're suggesting the regular budget cycle won't force it. Is I think what you were suggesting, Senator Portman, in terms of Rob, you were suggesting.
But we're not going to get your big reform done in 2 weeks. That's the issue, or change the tax system, which with the Trump tax cuts added a whole.
But I think you're suggesting use a process to get to reform.
Yeah,
Anyway, okay.
I wouldn't even.
Sorry, we're going to bring it back here. We're going to bring it back here. We could have a good policy discussion, as you could see. I'm all for that. I think with the 3 of us would support a 2-year budget. Actually, before Lamar Alexander left, he and I thought about doing one of the commissions on getting people confirmed, because you can't run, you just can't run. It's way too hard to run the government. You go
and Lamar, to his credit, we did pass a rule to reduce the amount by about 20%.
We did.
But then there were more added after that.
Yes. So last question. And it's interesting because it relates to something you said, Rob, about the media and all these things. And one of your colleagues, actually, Amy, you mentioned this colleague, Chris Murphy. He actually wrote a piece, I think it was co-authored with an academic, and it was about how our nation has swung. And this actually gets to the Founding Fathers. It wasn't Federalist Number 10. Sorry, David, I'm not going to use that. But it was Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. And it has swung away from the community to the individual. That one of the biggest problems that we have that gets expressed through the form of some of the media issues you were talking about, that we have a nation that focuses more on, we all focus on individualism more than focus on community. It's the liberty democracy kind of thing. And I'd love to hear, as we close out, how you all think about that concept. And I think it's really important for so many of our students that are here to hear your all's thinking about it. I found it a very interesting piece.
So I think that people have been shook up recently, and maybe it's the era of Donald Trump and the insurrection and the like, but people have stepped back. It's understandable that in today's world where everyone's looking at pictures of themselves on Instagram, and the way that all has become so internalized, the forces of the pandemic, and as Rob was pointing out, how people have been pushed not just even politically to different stations and different streaming services, but even in the culture and what they're watching. That all leads to individual focus and separate focus as opposed to what we have in common. So what are the signs that we could kind of swing back the other way? I think that the first sign was American pushback after Trump, honestly, and the pushback even in the midterms, where when election deniers were on the ballot, you actually saw moderate Republicans, independents, and Democrats voting the most on, in Minnesota this was true, for a Secretary of State candidate that most people didn't know as well as, say, the other candidates. But that had the highest voter turnout because of running against an election denier. And you saw that in some other states as well, or in Arizona or other places, where that really mattered to people. The assault on Speaker Pelosi's husband, that people just thought, oh my God, what are we turning into? And this is someone, again, another deranged person who's reading all this stuff again and believing it. So to me, there is American pushback on the extremes, and that is really important. And Liz Cheney's role, and Adam Kinzinger, and the January 6th committee, all of that was actually, I think people thought, why do we care about this? They do care about that. The other thing is just actually the war in Ukraine. And I know there's a lot of questions, are Republicans still there and all of that? Man, people stood up for that in a big way, and they are still standing up for that. And that simple moment when President Zelensky went to the street corner when everyone had counted him out, except maybe Rob and me and a few other people. The whole world had thought, all these people at the Munich Security Conference were telling us, oh, it's only going to last 2 weeks. And he went down there and said the simple words, we are here. We are here. And he got his country to go with him, and he got the world to go with him. And if he wouldn't have done it, Vladimir Putin wouldn't have just invaded Ukraine. There was no stopping him. So it is a hard slog, that war, I know. But remember, it woke people in bright blue and yellow from their slumber about what it means to be a democracy. And I still think, as hard as it is, that is still there in our psyche. And so those kinds of things, and people having moments of kindness and reaching out and seeing each other again, whether it's high school sporting events or parades, and being at things now where I just see tons of people, that's going to change things. That makes people see each other and at least have an opportunity to civilly debate and see someone you really didn't think you wanted to see again, but maybe they're okay. Those kinds of things, we have to get back into that if we're going to have any kind of a democracy in a civil society. And so those are the things that give me hope as I look at what's going on. And then the final thing that gives me hope is people like Rob Portman, who are willing to show courage in a lot of difficult circumstances politically.
Rob.
Well, Amy gave me hope when, after a 12-hour train ride on a mattress about as soft as this wooden table, she emerged from the train when we went to Ukraine together, and was in a good mood to meet President Zelensky.
I will note that you read President Biden took the train. My view, I told Rob, is that President Biden took the Orient Express with like velvet curtains, and he and I were on the Chicken Express.
Yeah.
Like people were literally had like baskets of cheese and chickens. Continue on.
I will say that one way I convinced Amy to join me on that trip was to tell her that there would be food served in the dining car and there were showers, which someone had told me, both of which were totally false. There was a big platter of cheese delivered to my
I think
seat
I
at one
see the
point.
person.
Yeah. Yeah. Good job. No, I think that was Matt's fault. Let me get back to your question just for a second. But seriously, Amy and I worked a lot together, and we still stay in touch. And thank goodness she's there. I read Chris's piece, and it was sort of academic. And Chris is a friend. We've done a lot together. We did legislation that's now, I think, quite effective from Russia and China. But we're just, we're way behind on that. So he's a guy also, and on the gun safety bill, willing to work across the aisle. But on this one, I think what de Tocqueville talked about in terms of what makes America special continues today, relative to other countries particularly, which is the civic participation. And in my hometown of Cincinnati, where I'm living now full time, but always we kept our home, and Jane's here. People are really involved in their community, as they are in your communities, here in Washington or wherever you're from. And that's a good thing about America. But there's a creeping loneliness, and that's where I really agree with what that paper talked about. And I think it was already there pre-COVID, but it exacerbated it. and it made more people feel more lonely. There was a stat over the weekend that I read about 30% of young women, girls who are in high school have contemplated suicide. 30%. And my daughter Sally is here somewhere, where she is, but she's no longer in high school, but I just think about that. You know, this is a whole generation that feels a loneliness and a sense of despair. We talk about the deaths of despair, you know, the increased suicides, the increased overdoses, many of which are caused by people medicating. And Amy and I work a lot in the area of opioids, and it's shifted these horrible pills now that people don't mean to take, think it's something else. But there is this trend in our country that's very disturbing. So to that degree, I found it helpful to read that. Now, what's the solution? I mean, the connectivity, you know, the ability to connect with your family and with friends and your neighbors and some club. And you remember the book Bowling Alone? Anybody read that? I mean, that was kind of one of the first indications that I became, you know, more aware of, that this is a national phenomenon. It's gotten worse, not better. So I gave a commencement address yesterday, seems like a week ago, and talked a little about this, you know, and I'm doing another one next weekend saying, you know, I mean, I think Amy and I can't play a huge role here. I think it's got to be something that's really in our culture deeper, but we can play a role in telling people, get engaged, get involved, be with people, go to, you know, join a sports team, join a bowling league, you know, do what it takes to connect with people. Because that, to me, is what I took out of that article is the biggest issue. It's not a political issue, but it is totally bipartisan. I mean, this isn't just Republicans and Democrats, or geographically, or white people, or black people. Or it's across the board, and I think the internet makes it a lot worse. So that's going to be with us, and you know, artificial intelligence isn't going to make it any better. No. It could make it worse. So. Anyway.
Thank you. And
on that happy note,
no, we're gonna bring it back up. We're gonna bring it back up. Want to thank you both. And Bowling Alone by Bob Putnam. The concept is we've evolved to a nation where we don't bowl together is the example, but there are many, many more in the book. And this loneliness concept that you touched on, there's another interesting piece by Ezra Klein, a podcast that we designed for loneliness, that I would also, if you're interested in these topics. But I want to close with just deep appreciation where I began. What you all do, and you've just left doing, but are continue doing in other ways, is so important. And it is the answer. It is the hope. There are two things in this room that are the hope and the answer. And one is that there are Amy Klobuchars and Rob Portmans that are in the United States Senate, that are mayors of cities, that are state legislators, and that does exist. And we don't always hear about that, but that does exist, and that's part of the hope. And the second thing is all the students that are here today in this room in terms of the hope. And that's what we do at this school is, and why you all are here, is because we believe that is the way this is going to work. That is this next generation, seeing the models, learning from people like you in terms of, and learning at a place that makes you listen to others, that talks about the facts, that teaches critical thinking so that we can get to the place where we have more. So that is the hope that I'm going to end with, and deep appreciation. And I think, Vicki, you're going to close us out.
Yes. Well, join me in thanking the senators and our president for this excellent conversation. I just want to invite everyone to join us up on the roof. Beautiful views, great food and drinks. So please make your way there. There's an elevator marked for us, and I hope to see you up there. But thank you for attending. And again, thanks for all you do.
Thank you. Yeah.